The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the hum of cicadas and the distant creak of wooden beams swaying under summer winds. In the sprawling South, where plantations stretched like kingdoms and men ruled like monarchs, a single decision was about to shatter not only one family but also a dynasty that had stood for generations. A colonel, proud and ruthless, carried within his chest both arrogance and desperation. What he was about to do, what he was about to offer, would be spoken of in whispers, carried through hallways like a curse, and remembered in secret histories that never made it into textbooks. For on that night, beneath the guise of honor and betrayal, he would give his own wife to 10 enslaved men, not out of love, not out of lust, but out of something darker. It was not merely an act of cruelty. It was a bargain, a transaction that twisted the very foundations of power, loyalty, and family. In this story lies a descent, from grandeur to ashes, from lineage to disgrace. And though the world may have tried to bury the truth, the echoes remain, etched in forgotten diaries, courtroom whispers, and the broken bones of those forced into silence. This is the story of a colonel, his wife, 10 enslaved men, and the poisoned agreement that destroyed an American dynasty. But before we continue with this disturbing story, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who loves hidden stories. It helps bring more of these untold truths to light. The man at the center of this tale was Colonel Henry Alston. Born in the waning years of the 18th century, in the shadow of the American Revolution, Henry's life was shaped by both privilege and violence. His family name carried weight. The Alstons were wealthy planters, owners of vast stretches of fertile Carolina soil, their wealth built on the backs of enslaved Africans whose labor made the Alstons lords of cotton and rice. Young Henry grew up not just in a house, but in a manor that stood like a fortress against the world. White pillars rose from the earth, a symbol of permanence, while enslaved servants tended to every detail of the estate, ensuring the family never felt the sweat of toil. But privilege breeds a peculiar hunger. For Henry, it manifested in a lust for control. He inherited not just land, but also the pride of generations, an unshakable belief that the Alston name was untouchable, ordained to rule, destined to last forever. From a young age, he was told he would carry the dynasty forward, that his life would be larger than life, that his decisions would shape the future. Yet within him was also the shadow of recklessness. For Henry loved gambling, and he loved to gamble not only with cards and dice, but with people's lives. By the time he reached manhood, Henry was already notorious across county lines for his arrogance. He rode his horses faster than others dared. He spent money in taverns with reckless abandon, and he drank whiskey as though it could wash away the ghosts of responsibility. But there was one arena where he was feared more than admired, the gambling halls. Beneath candlelight, with cards in hand, Henry Alston became a different creature, sharp-eyed, ruthless, daring. He won fortunes, lost them, and won them back again. To him, the game was never about money alone. It was about power, domination, the thrill of crushing another man's pride beneath his boots. Yet pride has a way of swallowing men whole. By the 1820s, debts began to mount. The cotton markets, unpredictable and volatile, no longer yielded the endless rivers of wealth he once knew. His fields required constant labor, and though the enslaved population on his plantation had swelled, so too had the costs of maintaining them. Worse still, Henry's reckless gambling streak had left him vulnerable. Behind closed doors, whispers spread. The colonel was faltering. His dynasty, once considered ironclad, was beginning to crack. It was in this crucible of desperation that his wife entered the stage, not as a partner, but as a pawn. Her name was Anne, a woman of beauty and grace caught in the tragic web of Henry's ambitions. She had been raised in refinement, taught to play piano, to paint, to walk with the elegance of a lady. But marriage had not brought her peace. Instead, it had placed her inside the gilded cage of Henry Alston's empire, where every smile she offered was met with suspicion, every step she took was monitored. Henry was not a gentle husband. He was jealous, erratic, and consumed by the idea that his wife was both his possession and his proof of power. The enslaved men of the plantation knew her face well. She walked among them sometimes, not with the authority of her husband, but with an almost ghost-like quiet. Some swore she carried sadness in her eyes. Others said she was kind in ways Henry never was, offering small mercies where he offered only commands. But no one could have imagined what role she would be forced to play in the twisted bargain that would come. One humid night, after another crushing loss in a gambling den, Henry Alston found himself cornered. His creditors, men of equal ruthlessness, demanded collateral. He had already mortgaged parcels of his land, already sold off prized horses. His debts were now not just financial, they were personal. His honor was questioned, his name mocked, and in that atmosphere of humiliation, Henry concocted a plan so unthinkable that even his closest companions were stunned when they heard it. He would wager his wife, but not in the way one might expect. This was not a matter of handing her over to another man in marriage or servitude. No, Henry's scheme was darker, more grotesque. He declared that he would offer Anne, his wife, to 10 of his own slaves. Not out of affection, not out of desire, but as a spectacle. A humiliation so profound it would shake the very foundations of his household. To him, this was not just an act. It was a gamble with destiny itself. If he could prove himself willing to commit such a deed, he believed it would strike fear into his enemies, silence their laughter, and reclaim his dominance. The arrangement was made in hushed tones, sealed in drunken oaths and the clink of glasses. No contract was signed, for this was not a legal transaction. It was a performance of power, a declaration of madness. Word spread quickly, whispered through the corridors of the manor, carried in the nervous glances of enslaved men who suddenly found themselves drawn into a nightmare. 10 were chosen, strong men, laborers of the fields, men whose lives had been chained in obedience, now commanded to do something that cut against their very souls. What must have raced through Anne's mind when she was told? Historians can only speculate, for no diary survives from her hand, but we can imagine the terror, the despair, the betrayal. A woman raised to be the jewel of society, now reduced to the object of her husband's perverse bargain. To deny him was impossible. To resist would mean violence. The very slaves commanded into this grotesque act were themselves victims, forced to carry out what they did not wish to. In this moment, power revealed itself not as strength, but as a corruption that poisoned everyone it touched. The night it happened, the manor was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Lanterns flickered in the halls, shadows stretching long against the wooden floors. The 10 men were brought forward, their faces grim, their bodies trembling with both fear and confusion. Anne was led into the chamber, her steps faltering, her eyes wide with horror. And at the center of it all stood Henry Alston, watching, not with love, not even with desire, but with the twisted satisfaction of a man who believed he was asserting control. This was the agreement. This was the act, and it was the moment that destroyed the Alston dynasty forever, for after this night nothing would remain the same. The silence after that night was heavier than the act itself. Within the grand walls of the Alston estate, a coldness settled like a fog that refused to lift. Anne could no longer walk the halls as she once had. Her footsteps were now shadows of humiliation, her very presence a reminder of the atrocity her husband had sanctioned. Servants averted their eyes, afraid to meet her gaze, yet unable to erase the image from their minds. For those who lived under Henry's command, the household itself seemed cursed, as though the walls had absorbed the shame and carried it within their beams. Anne did not speak of it, not to her husband, not to the enslaved women who dressed her hair, not even in letters to her distant family. Silence was her only shield, but silence was also a prison. Inside her, a storm brewed. She had been stripped not only of dignity but of agency, and in that moment, something in her heart had shifted forever. The woman who once submitted quietly to Henry's moods now looked upon him with eyes of ice. What he had destroyed was not just trust or love, but the invisible bond that holds 2 lives together. Henry, however, emerged from the night with a grotesque satisfaction. In his mind, he had proven himself untouchable. Rumors did swirl, whispers that the colonel had gone mad, that he had broken every code of honor, but fear of him was enough to keep tongues from wagging too loudly. For a time, he believed he had regained control. He carried himself with renewed arrogance, attending social gatherings as though nothing had happened, gambling once more with reckless abandon, riding his horses through the countryside with that same dangerous pride. Yet beneath the surface, his empire was rotting. The enslaved men who had been forced into the act carried a wound of their own. To the world they were considered property, voiceless, powerless, expected to obey. But within them human hearts still beat, hearts that had been thrust into an impossible position. Some carried guilt, others anger, but all carried memory. And memory is dangerous. On plantations, whispers traveled faster than the overseer's whip. By dawn, the story had reached every corner of the estate. Enslaved mothers clutched their children tighter, elders shook their heads in disbelief, and young men looked toward the colonel with a hatred that could no longer be masked. Something had shifted in the balance of power. Henry had exposed not strength, but a weakness, a madness that undermined the very image of dominance he sought to preserve. Anne, meanwhile, began to retreat into herself. She spent hours in her chambers, staring out the windows at the fields where enslaved men and women bent under the sun. She watched their movements with new eyes, no longer separated by the illusions of class and race that Henry clung to. She understood now that she too had become a prisoner, her golden cage no less binding than the chains of those who worked the land. Her sorrow turned into bitterness, and bitterness into resolve. For though she was trapped, she began to dream of ways she might reclaim what Henry had taken. The community beyond the plantation also began to take note. Neighbors who once held the Alstons in high regard now avoided them in subtle ways. Invitations to dinners grew fewer, eyes lingered too long when Anne entered a room, and Henry himself was no longer treated with unquestioned respect. Whispers followed him into taverns and trading houses. Men laughed behind his back, mocking the very act he believed had restored his honor. To gamble away dignity was one thing, but to gamble away his wife's body was another entirely. Even in a society built on slavery and cruelty, there were lines that, when crossed, corroded a man's reputation. The dynasty, once thought unshakable, began to crumble from within. Anne's family, living miles away in Charleston, eventually caught word of the scandal. Letters arrived, written in careful, veiled language, expressing concern for her well-being. They urged her to return home, to leave Henry, and escape the shame he had forced upon her. But to leave him was no simple matter. Divorce in that era was almost unthinkable for women, and in the world Anne inhabited, leaving her husband would mean disgrace not only for herself, but for her entire family. She was trapped between ruin and ruin, stay and endure, leave and destroy her lineage. Henry sensed her coldness, but he mistook it for weakness. In truth, Anne's silence was hardening into something far more dangerous: resolve. She began keeping secret correspondence with her brother, who despised Henry for his cruelty. In her letters, she hinted at the torment she endured, at the shame she could not voice openly. Her brother urged her to collect evidence, to hold her silence until the right moment, and then strike with legal fury. But what evidence could she collect in a world where the word of a woman, especially against a man of Henry's stature, carried little weight? The enslaved men, too, were not silent among themselves. They gathered in hushed circles at night, voices low, speaking of what had been forced upon them. Some were haunted by guilt, others by rage. One, an elder named Isaac, spoke with a heavy voice. "The colonel is a man who thinks he owns even God's breath. But men like him fall. They always fall." His words were a prophecy, whispered in the dark, carried like sparks in the wind. As months passed, the estate became a place of unease. Harvests were poor, debts grew heavier, and Henry's gambling continued unabated. His pride would not let him admit weakness. He borrowed against what little remained, promised futures that no longer existed, and demanded more from the enslaved laborers who already gave everything. Whippings grew harsher, punishments more severe, as he lashed out at the only people he could still control. But brutality breeds resistance. Beneath the surface, anger simmered, and the seeds of rebellion began to take root. Anne, watching it all, felt herself changing. She was no longer the naive bride who had once tried to see the good in her husband. She was something else now, hardened, bitter, but also awake. And in her awakening, she began to see an opportunity. If Henry's empire collapsed, she might escape with something of her own: land, inheritance, perhaps even her freedom from him. But to do so, she would need allies. Unexpectedly, she found them not among her family, not among her social circle, but among those whom Henry had always considered beneath him. One evening, as lanterns flickered low in the servants' quarters, Anne stepped silently into the world of the enslaved. Her presence startled them at first. A mistress rarely crossed such boundaries. But she came not with commands, but with questions. She wanted to understand. She wanted to know how they endured, how they saw her, how they remembered the night of her humiliation. At first they hesitated, fearful that this was a trap, that Henry had sent her to test their loyalty. But as the nights went on, they saw in her eyes something genuine. Pain, yes, but also rebellion. And so slowly, a strange bond began to form. Anne and the enslaved men and women of the plantation, two worlds meant to be divided, found themselves united by a common enemy, Henry Alston. The colonel, oblivious, continued down his path of destruction. He drank more heavily, gambled with men who circled him like wolves, and spent hours shouting at overseers about production. His once pristine estate was falling into disrepair. The fences sagged, the gardens grew wild, the very air seemed heavy with decay. He clung to his title, Colonel, as though it could protect him from reality. But the truth was undeniable. His dynasty was crumbling. The breaking point came one sweltering summer afternoon. A creditor arrived at the estate demanding repayment. Henry, red-faced and drunk, shouted him down in the front yard, waving a pistol, cursing him with words so foul that even the enslaved children hid their faces. But this creditor was not a man to be intimidated. He left, vowing to return with the law. And when the law came, it would not only strip Henry of his property, but also expose the rot that lay within the Alston household. Inside the house, Anne listened to the argument, her heart pounding. She realized then that Henry's downfall was no longer a distant possibility. It was imminent. And when it came, she would have to choose, stand beside him and fall with him, or break free and survive. What she did not know was that forces outside her control were already moving. The enslaved men had begun to plan, not just whispers of resistance, but something larger. The days after that fateful night carried a silence thicker than any storm. It was the kind of silence that settles not only in rooms, but in hearts, in the corners of people's minds, as if the very air refuses to move. Anne walked through the halls of the Alston estate like a specter. She no longer spoke to her husband except in clipped, cold words, and even then only when necessity demanded it. Her once bright eyes, which had seemed almost to glow in candlelight, now dulled to glassy pools that reflected nothing but pain. For the enslaved men forced into that unspeakable act, the aftermath was a torment of its own. Their chains had never felt heavier, their breaths never more suffocating. In them burned not only shame, but also the unrelenting fear that any slip of the tongue, any glance that lingered too long in Anne's direction, would invite Henry's wrath. What had been done to them was not an act of freedom or desire. It was a command, a grotesque command that ripped apart the fabric of their humanity. And Henry Alston? He moved about as though nothing had happened. At least outwardly. To guests and neighbors, he maintained the same swagger, the same sharp laugh that echoed through taverns. Yet inside he was unraveling. His debts had not disappeared. His creditors still lingered like wolves circling wounded prey, and the whispers about his madness only grew louder. Men spoke of him at gaming tables and in courthouse steps, shaking their heads at the lengths to which he had gone. The story, though not written down in the polite annals of history, spread by word of mouth, each retelling adding fuel to his infamy. Anne's family soon learned of it. Her brother, a man of quieter disposition but fierce loyalty, traveled from his own estate upon hearing rumors. When he arrived, he found his sister pale and fragile, her voice brittle, her spirit cracked. In her presence, Henry behaved as though nothing were amiss, but in private he dismissed his brother-in-law's anger with contempt. "She is mine," he hissed, his breath reeking of whiskey. "What I do with what is mine is no man's business but my own." But the matter would not rest so easily. Southern society at the time was a theater of appearances. Honor was currency, and shame was poison. For a colonel to have subjected his wife to such degradation, whether whispered true or exaggerated by gossip, was to stain not only his name but also hers, and by extension her entire family's. Where once invitations had flowed to balls and dinners, now there was hesitation. Neighbors greeted Anne with pitying glances, while Henry was met with the kind of forced politeness that hides disgust. The enslaved community on the plantation bore witness to the fractures within the house. In hushed conversations in cabins at night, they spoke of Anne with quiet reverence, as though she were a fallen angel brought low by the cruelty of a master who saw the world only as a game of dominance. Some said her suffering made her one of them, not equal, never free, but touched by the same cruelty that chained their lives. Others feared for her, for they knew that when Henry's pride was wounded, his violence grew. Time, however, does not heal wounds like these. It deepens them. Henry's debts grew more perilous. In Charleston, in Savannah, in the smoky corners of gambling dens, his name was spoken with derision. He had lost not only money but reputation, and reputation was the foundation of a planter's power. Without it, men would not lend him credit, would not trust him at tables, would not honor his word. To rebuild his image, Henry reached for the only tools he knew: intimidation and spectacle. He began to speak openly of the agreement he had made, boasting as though it were proof of his absolute control. To some it was horrifying. To others, men equally steeped in the darkness of power, it was evidence of ruthless strength. Yet even among the cruelest of his peers there was unease. For in the South of that era, even slaveholders recognized boundaries of appearance. What Henry had done was not merely cruel, it was obscene. It blurred the rigid lines of race, class, and gender upon which the entire Southern hierarchy was built. Anne, meanwhile, withered. She withdrew from public life, seldom leaving the manor, her voice growing quieter, her health beginning to falter. At night, she was said to sit by the window, staring out across the fields where enslaved men and women moved like shadows under moonlight. Perhaps she wondered which of them had been chosen, which had been forced, which remembered her with sorrow. Perhaps she prayed that none would ever speak of it aloud. The dynasty that Henry had inherited began to collapse under the weight of his madness. Tenants left, overseers muttered about the colonel's instability, and the enslaved, though still bound by chains, sensed the crumbling of the house that had once seemed unshakable. Power is a fragile illusion, and once it cracks, it can never again be whole. What truly destroyed Henry Alston was not a single act, but the reverberations of it. His children, growing older, bore the stigma of whispers they did not understand. Anne's family, increasingly estranged, cut ties to preserve their own standing. And Henry himself, restless and tormented, sank deeper into drink, into rage, into the very shadows he had once believed he controlled. History is cruel in what it preserves. The documents that survive speak little of Anne, less of the enslaved men who endured her husband's command. Yet between the lines of estate ledgers, in the fragments of court records, in the oral histories passed down quietly, we catch glimpses of truth. The colonel's estate declined, parcels of land were sold, debt swallowed the fortune, and within a generation, the Alston dynasty, once rich, once feared, was scattered like ashes in the wind. For what Henry had done was more than personal cruelty. It was a violation of the unspoken codes that governed Southern power. He had turned his own wife into a token of a wager, reduced her humanity before both white society and the enslaved. And in doing so, he had revealed the grotesque heart of his own arrogance. No dynasty can survive when built on such rot. And so the name Alston, once spoken with reverence in Carolina halls, became instead a cautionary whisper, a name associated not with honor, but with disgrace. And the woman at the center of it all, Anne, faded into history's margins, remembered only in the ghost of her suffering, the shadow of her sorrow. But the story did not end there. For the enslaved men forced into that act carried its memory in their bloodlines, in the silence of generations who bore the scars of what had been done. Their descendants, unknown and unrecorded, would live on, while the dynasty of the colonel crumbled into dust. In the end, the power he believed eternal proved fragile. His gamble destroyed not only his name, but his very legacy, and all of it began with one night, one bargain, one unthinkable agreement. The years that followed turned Henry Alston into a man haunted by shadows of his own making. Though he strutted about his estate as though he still carried the weight of a dynasty on his shoulders, the reality was starkly different. The manor, once brimming with life, with laughter spilling from its grand halls during balls and feasts, grew quieter. The doors were less often open to guests, the carriages that once lined the driveway now fewer and farther between. Henry, once sought after as a host, was now avoided. His name, once commanding respect, now carried a sharp, uncomfortable edge whenever spoken. Anne retreated almost entirely from the world. She had once been the ornament of gatherings, admired for her grace, her poise, the lilt of her voice when she played piano for guests. Now she was seldom seen beyond the walls of the estate. Some whispered she had fallen ill, others that she had descended into melancholy, her spirit broken. Those closest to her family knew better. Anne had been hollowed out by humiliation, abandoned to her suffering in a marriage that had devoured her dignity. Henry's children grew in this atmosphere of decay. They were raised in rooms where silence replaced joy, in halls that echoed not with music but with the sharp crack of their father's temper. They inherited not wealth but whispers. In schoolrooms and churchyards, other children repeated things they had overheard from their parents. Rumors of their mother, of their father, of the night that no polite Southerner would name aloud, but all seemed to know in fragments. Shame clung to them like a second skin, pressing down on their shoulders before they were even old enough to understand its source. Henry himself refused to acknowledge this collapse. He rode into town with the same air of superiority, but where once he had been feared, now he was mocked behind his back. In gambling dens, men smirked as he entered, some bold enough to let their laughter slip into the open. He answered mockery with fury, once even drawing his pistol in a fit of rage, only to find the crowd unfazed. A man who had humiliated himself so deeply could no longer command fear. He could only demand it, and demands are rarely obeyed. As debt swallowed his estate, he sold off parcels of land, then livestock, then furniture from the manor itself. What remained was a shell of the empire his forefathers had built. The grandeur of the Alston dynasty shrank with every transaction, every desperate measure. Yet Henry refused to admit defeat. In his mind he remained the colonel, the master of men, the keeper of a legacy that could never be broken. But dynasties die not only in ledgers and land deeds, they die in the hearts of those who carry the name. Anne's health deteriorated with each passing year. Her once rosy cheeks grew pale, her frame delicate as though she might break beneath the weight of her sorrow. Physicians were called, but they could offer nothing. For her ailment was not of the body but of the spirit. She carried within her a wound that no medicine could mend, a scar carved not by disease but by betrayal. The enslaved community watched this unraveling with eyes sharpened by years of survival. They had always known that power in such houses was not as stable as it appeared. They had seen masters fall into ruin, fortunes crumble, plantations change hands. Yet what set the Alston decline apart was the story at its heart. For the enslaved men who had been forced into Henry's agreement carried with them a memory so heavy it seemed to ripple through every part of the estate. They bore no blame, yet guilt gnawed at them, as though they had been complicit in Anne's suffering. They lived with the knowledge that their bodies had been used as instruments of her humiliation, commanded into an act that bound them in shame as surely as their chains bound their wrists. Among themselves, in hushed tones around fires late at night, they spoke of Anne with a strange mix of sorrow and reverence. She was white, yes, and she had lived as the mistress of their oppressor. Yet in her suffering they recognized something that tethered her fate to theirs. She, too, had been made a victim of Henry's cruelty, her humanity crushed under the same heel that crushed theirs. Some even believed that the collapse of the Alston estate was a kind of divine justice, a reckoning not only for slavery, but for the grotesque bargain that had poisoned the house. By the early 1830s, Henry Alston was a man adrift. His debts had grown insurmountable. His creditors pressed harder, some threatening legal action that would strip him of the last remnants of his estate. He drank more heavily, his temper erupting in violent bursts that terrified not only his enslaved workers, but also his own children. The colonel, who once exuded confidence, now stumbled through halls reeking of whiskey, shouting at ghosts no one else could see. Anne's family, long estranged, made one final attempt to intervene. Her brother returned, this time with more force, urging her to leave Henry, to seek refuge in their home. But the laws of the South were not kind to women. Divorce was scandalous, nearly impossible without ruin, and Anne, weakened and resigned, refused to leave. She was tethered to the estate not by love but by chains of a different sort, the unyielding chains of societal expectation and fear of disgrace. It was said that in her final years, Anne seldom spoke above a whisper. She spent long hours by her window, gazing across the fields, as though searching for something beyond the horizon. Some believed she looked for freedom, others that she prayed for death. When she finally passed, the news was met with little ceremony. A quiet burial, a few relatives in attendance, and whispers of pity from neighbors who no longer cared to hide their disdain for Henry. Her death marked the true end of whatever thread still held the Alston family together. Henry, though outwardly defiant, was shattered by her absence. Yet even in grief he found no redemption. Instead, he spiraled further, consumed by rage, drink, and the relentless echo of whispers that would never die. By the mid-1830s, the Alston estate was broken. The lands had been divided, the manor stripped of its grandeur, the dynasty reduced to memory. Henry himself, once a figure of arrogance, now staggered through the ruins of his own making. His children carried the shame into adulthood, some fleeing the region entirely, attempting to escape the stain of their father's legacy, and the enslaved. They endured. Long after Henry's name was spoken only in hushed tones of ridicule, the men and women he had enslaved continued their lives, carrying within them stories of suffering, but also of survival. The memory of that night, of the agreement that had shattered a dynasty, lingered like smoke. Passed in whispers, retold in fragments. It became part of an unwritten history, a history of cruelty, resilience, and the quiet collapse of a man who believed himself untouchable. Dynasties are not destroyed in a single moment, though they may begin with one. They unravel piece by piece, eroded by shame, by greed, by the reckoning of choices made in arrogance. Henry Alston's dynasty died not with a battle, not with a fire, but with a bargain made in drunken pride, a bargain that consumed his wife, his children, his legacy, and finally himself. And though history books seldom record his name, the echoes remain. For in the South, where power was built on the backs of the enslaved, the tale of the colonel who wagered his wife was a reminder. Even the mightiest fall. And when they do, the fall is not quiet. It reverberates through generations. When Anne was lowered into the ground, the earth closed not only over her body but over the last trace of dignity the Alston family ever possessed. The funeral was modest, attended by a handful of relatives, a few curious neighbors, and the enslaved who were made to stand at a distance, their eyes lowered though their hearts burned with complex feelings. Some wept quietly, not for their mistress in her privilege, but for the woman they had seen move through the estate like a ghost, marked by suffering that mirrored their own. Others stood in silence, hardened by years of endurance, carrying grief the way they carried chains, without expression, but heavy all the same. Henry stood rigid at the graveside, his face carved into stone as though the act of mourning were beneath him, but those who watched him closely saw something breaking. He was not a man weeping for love lost. He was a man crumbling under the weight of everything he had done, yet even then he would not speak it aloud. Pride had long ago turned to poison in his veins, and to admit fault, to name his shame, would have been a death of another kind. After Anne's passing, the children were left adrift in a house that felt colder by the day. The eldest son, James, tried to carry himself with the authority his father demanded, but he was too young to shoulder the burden. At school, he endured whispers, boys mocking him with the cruel repetition of stories they had heard from their fathers, about his mother, about the night, about the colonel who gambled away not money but dignity itself. For a boy, such taunts were knives, and he grew bitter, angry, withdrawn. The daughters bore their shame differently. They moved through drawing rooms and gatherings with downcast eyes, hearing the stifled laughter, feeling the sidelong glances. In the South of that era, a woman's worth was measured by her purity, her family's honor, the respectability of her name. The Alston daughters, through no fault of their own, had been robbed of all three. Suitors avoided them. Mothers whispered warnings to their sons. The stain of Henry's madness clung to them so tightly that no silk dress, no charm, no smile could conceal it. The enslaved community, meanwhile, lived in the ruins of Henry's pride. They continued to work the fields, to cook his meals, to raise his children even as their own families were torn apart by sales and debts. But the story of what had been forced upon 10 of their own was never forgotten. It became a kind of secret scripture, spoken softly in the cabins, carried from parent to child. Not in detail, for the shame of it was too heavy to recount fully, but in the broad strokes of truth, that the master had forced upon them something monstrous, that his cruelty had destroyed not only them, but his own family as well. By the late 1830s, Henry was a ruin of a man. His estate had dwindled to a fraction of its former glory. He sold more land, more people. Each transaction another stone pulled from the crumbling walls of his dynasty. His drinking worsened. Some nights he could be heard shouting Anne's name into the dark halls of the manor, as though she might return, as though she might forgive him. But she never came, and the silence that answered him was heavier than any rebuke. The children grew into adults carrying his shadow. James left Carolina altogether, traveling north under an assumed name. He believed perhaps that distance could sever the chain of whispers. Yet wherever he went, the past clung to him. His bitterness hardened into cruelty, and he repeated the cycle in smaller ways: short tempers, failed ventures, relationships shattered by mistrust. The daughters fared no better. One was married off quietly to a man of lower standing, a match arranged not for love, but to salvage whatever sliver of reputation could be saved. Another remained unmarried, living in the fringes of society, whispered about until her final days. The Alston name, once thunderous in Carolina, faded to a murmur. Other families rose, their fortunes built on new cotton fields, new railroads, new ventures. The Alstons were left behind, remembered not for their wealth or their contributions, but for their scandal. Yet for the enslaved, the memory of that night lived on with a different weight. It became a reminder that even the most powerful masters could be undone by their own cruelty. Some believed it was divine justice, that God himself had looked upon what Henry had done and marked his house for ruin. Others carried it as a scar of humiliation, a reminder of how deeply their humanity had been violated. For generations the story lingered, never written, never recorded in ledgers, but passed through bloodlines as a truth that refused to die. By the time of the Civil War, the Alston name was little more than an echo. The plantation lands, divided and sold, fell into the hands of others. Henry himself, aged and broken, watched as the world shifted beneath his feet. Where once his word had been law, now whispers of abolition and freedom stirred the air. He was a relic of a decaying order, clinging to a past that no longer recognized him. It is said that in his final years, Henry rarely left his home. The once proud colonel, who had ridden tall on horseback and thrown dice with the confidence of a king, now shuffled through empty halls, muttering to himself. Servants described him as haunted, prone to sudden bursts of anger followed by long spells of silence. He died not with a roar but with a whimper, his body wasting away in the very house he had poisoned with his deeds. And so the Alston dynasty ended, not with fire, not with war, but with disgrace. The land scattered, the children dispersed, the name forgotten by polite society. What remained was only the story, carried quietly through generations of both white descendants who tried to bury it and black descendants who refused to forget. The colonel who gave his wife to 10 slaves believed he was proving his power. Instead, he proved his fragility, for power rooted in cruelty is never eternal. It rots from within, collapsing under the weight of its own corruption. The war came like a storm, tearing apart the fabric of the South. The crack of rifles, the thunder of cannons, the smoke of burning plantations. It swept across Carolina and left behind only ruin. For the descendants of Henry Alston's enslaved, the war was not a storm but a dawn. Freedom, fragile and contested, arrived not as a gift but as a fight, carried on the backs of Union soldiers and secured by the blood of those who had long yearned for it. By then, the Alston estate was already broken. The manor stood weathered, its white pillars stained, its windows cracked. Land once thick with cotton lay fallow, neglected, parceled away to pay debts. There was no dynasty left to defend, no fortune to salvage. What the colonel had destroyed in arrogance, war merely buried. The freedmen who once labored under the weight of Henry's cruelty now carried their lives into a new era. Some left the region, seeking wages in towns or land of their own. Others remained near the soil that had enslaved them, tied not by chains but by memory. For them, freedom was both a blessing and a ghost, haunted by stories their fathers and grandfathers had whispered, of the night the colonel gave his wife to 10 men, of the humiliation that had poisoned both master and slave alike. The children of Henry scattered. James, the son who had fled north, tried to re-establish himself after the war, but never shed the bitterness etched into him. His own children grew without wealth, without legacy, carrying a name that meant nothing in the new order of America. The daughters' lines blended quietly into other families, their shame diluted but never entirely erased. Within 2 generations, the name Alston was barely spoken, its grandeur forgotten, its story reduced to fragments. But among the freed, the story endured. Passed quietly in cabins, in churches, in fields where elders taught the young, it became a kind of parable. Not of triumph, not of victory, but of reckoning. It reminded them that even the mightiest oppressors could destroy themselves, that cruelty could hollow out even the grandest dynasty. Anne's name lingered too, not in books, not in monuments, but in sorrow. Some remembered her as a woman of quiet kindness, others as a figure of tragic endurance. Her suffering became part of the story, intertwined with that of the enslaved men who had been forced into her humiliation. In her silence, in her decline, she became a symbol of how Henry's cruelty devoured not only those he enslaved, but even those he claimed to love. As the South rebuilt in the years of Reconstruction, new families rose, new fortunes were made, and the old planter dynasties faded into memory. The Alstons were not among the names preserved in marble or carved into courthouse walls. Their story survived only in whispers, an infamy passed down in shadow, too shameful for polite society to record, too powerful for the oppressed to forget. History is often written by those who wish to cleanse it. The textbooks would speak of plantations, of battles, of presidents and generals, but they would not speak of Henry Alston's bargain. They would not tell of the night when arrogance reached its most grotesque form. And yet, beneath the silence of official history, the story lived on because the truth has a way of surviving, even when men try to bury it. Henry Alston believed he could gamble with anything: land, money, people, even his wife's body. He believed his dynasty would endure no matter the cost, because power had always seemed eternal in his hands. But the agreement he made revealed the truth. Power without humanity is an illusion. It corrodes from the inside, leaving only ashes. Today, the Alston name is gone, but the lesson remains. Cruelty does not build legacies, it destroys them. Pride does not preserve families, it poisons them. And dynasties forged in domination are destined to collapse, because what is built on suffering cannot stand forever. The colonel who gave his wife to 10 slaves did not merely disgrace himself. He destroyed the very thing he thought untouchable, his dynasty. And in the end, what survived was not his name, not his wealth, not his pride, but the memory of those he tried to silence. It is in their whispers, their survival, their descendants, that the true legacy lives. And it is in the fall of the Alstons that we are reminded. History may bury the names of tyrants, but it never forgets their sins.